Welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving into a concept that is, well, it's become incredibly relevant, especially as we see ancient philosophies like Stoicism sort of repackaged and sold as modern life hacks.
Right, as tools. Tools for optimizing suffering or building instant resilience, And this modern push towards radical acceptance, it really demands a closer look.
It does, and the tension at the heart of it is, it's profound. Our central question today is whether the ultimate affirmation of necessity, the idea of amor fati, or loving one's fate, is truly the height of freedom and strength.
Or if, in practice, it's just an elegant way of packaging quiet resignation, a kind of aesthetic for weakness. Are we really commanding our lives when we accept everything, or we just found a beautiful way to give up?
And I'll be holding that amor fati is exactly that rigorous height of self-mastery. It is the maximal expression of a creative will to freedom.
And I'm going to argue that more often than not, this kind of acceptance functions as a very subtle form of self-deception. It's the aestheticization of surrender. We have to be careful not to mistake exhaustion for virtue.
Genuine affirmation of fate, for me, is the exact opposite of submission. It's the maximal expression of the will to power, the most profound form of self-overcoming. To get there, you have to embrace this formula for greatness, to affirm everything that has ever happened and everything that will, to not want anything to be different, not forwards, not backwards, not for all eternity. This isn't passive, it's a command. This level of affirmation, it requires you to actively see what is necessary in things, and that includes suffering, that includes tragedy, to see it as beautiful. Because that is what gives the individual the creative power to make things beautiful. This is the will that emancipates. It's fundamentally opposed to the weakness that just seeks the comfort of the lack of pain.
The philosophical demand here is to embrace the tragic nature of life, affirming all its cycles, tested by the eternal recurrence.
Only this absolute acceptance signifies a great healthiness and rises above the herd.
That is a beautifully compelling ideal. I mean, it really is, but ideals are rarely how these concepts actually function in the messy reality of human psychology. The apparent strength you describe in radical acceptance is, I think, often just a psychological trick, interpreting your own powerlessness as some kind of virtue. I come at it from a different way. This rigid insistence on affirmation, it echoes the old critique of Stoicism, which forces one to see nature falsely, that is to say, stoically. The philosophical system itself becomes a tyrannical impulse, demanding we make the world in its own image. We're dealing with profound psychological expediency here. When you scrutinize this self-proclaimed strength, you have to be ruthless.
Historically, these systems are described not as wisdom, but as expediency, mixed with stupidity, or statuesque coldness, aimed entirely at avoiding the chaos of life. This interpretation of necessity is just a sublime specimen of self-deception, where the individual is, frankly, just too tired to fight the chains, and so instead they learn to call them destiny.
I hear that critique, that this is just a survival mechanism or a way to minimize pain, but the true affirmation of Amor Fati, it demands we embrace pain and conflict. It's an affirmation through suffering, not an affirmation to avoid suffering.
Okay, but let's really dig into that, the relationship between willing and necessity. If you affirm all necessity, every single agonizing, unjust, mediocre moment repeating for infinity, where is the room left for the creative will? If everything is eternally fixed, what agency do you really have beyond just reinterpreting it? I find this insistence on embracing necessity suspiciously close to the extravagant pride of man to believe he can be his own cause, the causa sui. That's a compelling argument. But have you considered that by demanding the individual absorb all responsibility for their destiny, you're effectively absolving God, the world, ancestors, chance, and society therefrom?
It sounds like philosophy just creating the world in its own image. It's a tyrannical impulse. You're demanding that people retroactively apply agency to things that objectively just crush them.
That is a powerful way to frame the moral absurdity of it. And I do see your point, but let me offer a different perspective. This creative affirmation is precisely what moves beyond the metaphysical foolishness of desiring freedom of will in some superlative sense. We can agree the will isn't free in that naive way. Necessity has power. However, willing itself, the very act of saying, I willed it, that's what emancipates the individual from the debilitating forces of regret and resentment. It turns one's fate, the thing that simply is, into one's own command. It is the statement, just such a fate willeth my will. The weakness, philosophically, is the refusal to will no longer, and no longer valuing, and no longer creating. That impulse is a symptom of great debility, of nihilism. True Amor Fati fights this nihilism not by wishing for some impossible freedom, but by imposing new, commanded value onto the necessary structure of existence. We're not denying necessity. We're turning the brute fact of it into a desired path.
The difficulty then lies in telling the difference between that intellectual command and just emotional exhaustion. Is the person commanding their fate truly strong, or are they just the most effective self-tyrant?
Well, and that distinction brings us right to the interpretation of suffering, doesn't it? I maintain that affirming life, including its suffering, is a necessary requirement for great growth. Without it, any great growth, even of virtue, is scarcely possible. If you look at the common modern take on Stoicism, you see the desire for as little pleasure as possible to get as little pain as possible. That is precisely the mediocrity we have to avoid. The strength I'm talking about is not pain minimization. It's the capacity to endure and affirm the tragic, to actively transform pain into a sharpened strength to achieve a new healthiness that is stronger, sharper, tougher, bolder. The strong person digests the poison and is reinforced. The weak one is killed by it. The test is what you do with the suffering you cannot avoid.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. For the majority of people, this extreme self-discipline often looks exactly like the repressive mechanisms of the ascetic ideal, which prizes suffering for its own sake. You argue that suffering strengthens, but when the weary masses interpret their inability to change things as freedom, they're engaging in, well, it's described as practical Pecksniffianism, a kind of hypocritical moral vanity. They congratulate themselves on an acceptance that was actually forced on them. I mean, think of the modern narrative. A business venture collapses or a relationship fails, and we see this rush to say, oh, it was meant to be. I accept the lesson.
But that's a modern, diluted interpretation, not the rigor of the philosophical ideal. The ideal demands that you embrace the failure not as a quiet lesson, but as a necessary component of the overall work of art that is your life.
Yes, but look at how this aesthetic of suffering gets applied. The profound sufferer often uses an ostentatious boldness of taste or sublimity, as well as in the nobler deliriums of submission and resignation, as an anesthetic against protracted pain. It's not a path to strength, it's a painkiller. And consider the very origin of these philosophies. Stoicism is suggested as advisable for those who live in violent times and depend on impulsive and changeable people. This strongly suggests it's a survival tactic for the vulnerable, for the herd who can't afford turbulence. It's a psychological expediency, not an ideal for the sovereign individual who can genuinely command their circumstances. If your acceptance is a tool for surviving violence, then it is submission dressed up in dignity.
That's a fair critique of how it can be used by the vulnerable, but it confuses the means with the end. The discipline is the mechanism, sure, but the goal is transfiguration. The aestheticization you're pointing out only proves how deeply compelling the ideal of profound self-mastery actually is.
But the moment we truly love our chains, the pain becomes aestheticized in a detrimental way, and it masks true weakness. That brings us right to the critique of the aesthetics of disinterested contemplation. The Stoics found a higher triumph in remaining masters of the mob of the senses by throwing pale, cold, gray conceptual networks over them, concepts like duty, nature, fate. This approach, it just denies life's vitality. It leads to what's described as no more laughing and no more weeping. It is an impoverished self that seeks peace through emotional denial. I contend that the moment you elevate cold acceptance, you deny the necessity of struggle, of passionate creation, which is what actually strengthens the will.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. Amor Fati is not advocating for passive, detached contemplation. It's advocating for disciplined transformation through artistic creation. The creation of values is inherently an artistic act. The philosopher is described as the most spiritual will to power, the will to creation of the world. If the body can purify itself and exalteth itself through intelligent attempts, then the resulting acceptance of necessity isn't detachment. It's the rigorous discipline of long obedience in the same direction. It is the means to an end.
But the discipline is aimed at eliminating conflict, isn't it? If your goal is to be untouched by the world, you just achieve a kind of statuesque coldness.
No, the goal is to transform the conflict into something affirmed. The result of this whole process is the transfiguring of what is necessary, the chaos, the fate, into a work of art. And that is precisely what has always made life worth living. It leads to virtue, art, music, dancing, reason, spirituality. This is not an impoverished self. This is the philosopher as artist, forging something transfiguring, refined, foolish, or divine out of pure chaos. The acceptance is the material. The will is the sculptor.
I find that compelling for the exceptional individual, the true artist. But for most of us, that acceptance remains submission to the existing brutal order, just wrapped in the beautiful cloth of self-improvement. The philosophical ideal becomes a comfortable mask for those who are simply tired of fighting the necessary harshness of life. It's an easy sell in an age obsessed with productivity. Don't fight it, just accept it and move on. But what if what is required is profound, exhausting resistance?
And if that resistance is based on resentment, on the feeling that things should have been otherwise, then it is corrosive weakness. True resistance is directed at the future, affirming the past while building the new.
And true acceptance is born of sovereign strength, not exhaustion. The danger is that on the surface, those two motivations look identical.
In the end, Amor Fati stands as the supreme moral imperative for the higher type, a fierce active affirmation of existence in its totality, using rigorous self-discipline to transform fate into a vehicle for creative power. It demands we become commanders of necessity, making fate subservient to the will, not just obedient victims. This remains the only pathway to achieving great healthiness.
Conversely, the danger lies precisely in that blurring of lines, mistaking disciplined self-tyranny or just profound exhausted resignation for philosophical freedom. While the ideal of Amor Fati sounds like creation, for the majority who encounter it as a coping strategy, loving one's fate is still just a psychological expediency. It's an aesthetically pleasing mask worn by those too weary to wrestle with the hard, unjust nature of existence.
The distinction, then, between the affirmation of the artist and the resignation of the tired soul is the most crucial question one can ask when facing adversity. It forces us to examine the very nature of our own will.
And we're left to scrutinize the true motivation underlying our acceptance. Is it the strength of creation, or is it just the sophisticated longing for comfort, for the end of the struggle?
The source material demands that we examine the contents of our own heart when we decide to say yes to life, or if we're merely conceding to what we cannot change. The debate over whether we are free or merely resigned is contained entirely within that choice.